My name is Narissa Leung, and I am really, really proud to be involved in the Masterclass series. This is a push from Bastow to get high quality professional learning opportunities out to all areas across our state. As a former principal from a regional area, I'm really passionate about making sure that the regional and rural areas are reached when it comes to professional learning opportunities. That's why I'm really proud to be here tonight and a part of the Masterclass series. So tonight's Masterclass series, we're looking at formative assessment. We'll have a look at some understanding goals for the night. We are going to define formative assessment. We're looking at formative assessment in the bigger picture. The elements of formative assessment, we will be looking at 4 elements tonight. Unfortunately, it's only a 2-hour webinar, so we won't be going into too many elements. We'll just be looking at 4 of them. Having a quick look at formative assessment and the hits, and then we'll be looking at future learning opportunities for you. So really, if you take tonight as a bit of a tasting plate for your formative assessment learning, and hopefully it'll be the launching pad for future learning for you. Okay, so as I said, my name is Narissa Leung. I am currently a consultant in Victoria, and I'm a former primary school principal in Castlemaine. I am also this year facilitating 4 intakes of the Leading Literacy, Bastow Leading Literacy program. That's been really terrific learning, and 2 intakes of the Literacy Data and Assessment Practice course, affectionately known as the LDAP. So it's been terrific to be involved in that as well, and a lot of the learning from tonight's session feeds in really well to what's happening in the LDAP course. I'll talk a little bit more about the LDAP course as we go through the night. And as you can see on the slide there, my Twitter handle is @RissL. So just for tonight, have a little icon on the bottom of some of the slides, and that's encouraging you to share something in the chat. So we have a back channel happening at the moment. It's on Today's Meet. So the website address for that is todaysmeet.com/masterclass1. And I have some helpers at Bastow going through the chat and answering some of your questions. So we really encourage you to get involved in the chat. It certainly helps your learning when you can discuss what's being said. Let's look at the understanding goals for the night. The first one is that we're going to develop an understanding of the concept and application of a balanced approach to assessment. And really looking at what is a balanced approach to assessment. The second, we'll be developing an understanding of the key elements of formative assessment. And I said before, we'll be looking at 4 of the key elements tonight. And thirdly, you will be deepening your knowledge of the range of supporting resources that are available coming out of the department and other places to support you with integrating high quality teaching and learning practices to do with formative assessment. Just a note on online learning, my darling husband drew this one for me. After listening to some of the frustrations that I was having, it's step 1 to online learning is registering, but there's more than one step. Doing the work is step 2, and that's where the real learning happens. So this isn't going to be a 2-hour talk fest tonight. Thank goodness, you're saying, and so am I. We know that there's no research that would back that up as an effective teaching strategy, so we will pause during the night and have activities for you to complete, so reflection activities, and that's really where the real learning will occur. So I do encourage you strongly to engage fully in the reflection activities, and hopefully you will have received a package of supporting resources. That's a PDF document that was emailed out to participants. And hopefully that's printed off and sitting next to you alongside your assessment schedule. Okay, speaking of self-reflection, we're going to kick off the night with the first activity. I would like you to reflect on what you think you already know about formative assessment, that maybe a definition, the elements, possible benefits, and what do you wonder. So in your resource pack, you have a KWL chart to start on the first page. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to really think about this and to fill in the first 2 columns on that KWL chart. So what do you think you already know about formative assessment, and what are you wondering? And I would encourage you to put some of your wonderings into the chat, and hopefully we can address some of those tonight. So I'm going to start the timer. You'll have 5 minutes to engage in this reflection. Don't forget to pop some of your wonderings in the chat, and we'll get into some definitions as soon as our timer is up. Slow internet if you're only hearing music. Okay, thanks very much for participating in that. It is great to see your questions coming through in the chat, and I am looking forward to exploring some of these in the webinar tonight. I think most of you will have your wonderings answered in some form, or you'll have resources to go to seek answers, so that's really exciting. So do keep the questions coming. Little Bastow helpers are like little elves peddling away, reading the rest of them and giving me some feedback. So we're going to look at 3 definitions of formative assessment now. We'll start with this one from Moss and Brookhart. Now, Moss and Brookhart do a lot of writing on the topic of formative assessment. They say that it's an active and intentional process where teachers and students work together to continuously and systematically gather evidence of learning with the express goal of improving student achievement. Now, I know it is a long quote, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of the key words that I think are displayed in this quote. The first is that it's active and intentional. It's not something that we accidentally do. We go into the work intentionally looking to get data out of the students. It's about teachers and students working together. I think that's one of the things that sometimes separates it from summative assessment, because we're bringing the students on board as partners in this, and that's a really critical element of formative assessment. It's about gathering evidence, and it's about remembering that data isn't always numbers, and I think sometimes we forget that and we're only looking for numbers. So really redefining our ideas about what data and what evidence is. And ultimately it's about improving achievement. And we'll look at another quote that will help us better understand how we improve achievement. It is a long one, apologies, but I do think it's a good one. It's from Black and William, and they say that assessment is formative to the extent that evidence about student achievement is elicited, interpreted, and used by teachers, learners, or their peers to make decisions about next steps in instruction that are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have taken in the absence of the evidence that was elicited. So I think this one's what I really like about this one is that Black and William are talking about anyone can be the agent of formative assessment. This isn't something that just the teachers own. It's not just the teacher's domain. It involves teachers, learners, and peers. The focus of the definition is on the action. So we are really good, I think, now at getting the data in our schools and maybe sitting down and analysing it, but it's actually the next step that's the most important step. What do you do with the data? How do you change your practice? What action are you going to take as a result of the evidence and the data that you've collected? So I think that's our next really important body of work that we have to do in our Victorian schools. I'm wondering which definition appeals to you. I have a third one that is my favourite. Here it is. And I read this in Hattie's Visible Learning. It was from Bob Stake. He says, when the cook tastes the soup, it is formative, and when the guest tastes the soup, it is summative. And I love this because it gives a really visual image of what happens when we formatively assess. So formatively assessing, we are constantly dipping our spoon into the soup to make sure that it tastes just the way that we want it to taste. And I think a really important quote, Hattie goes on after this in his book to say that serving poor soup to the guests is probably the best indicator that the cook was lousy at tasting it during preparations. So that idea of if we're not formatively assessing, we have no idea what the soup is going to taste like or what our student standards and achievement is going to be like when we do come to a summative assessment. That's probably particularly relevant for something like NAPLAN. He does go on to say about the requirement for a balanced approach to assessment, and I see some of you have asked about that in the chat, how much time do we spend doing formative assessment versus summative assessment. He says we can't be sitting around tasting the soup all day, otherwise it'll be cold when we're serving it up to the guests. So we need to have that summative assessment so we know what the end game is and where we're heading, but it's really important that we're dipping our spoon into the soup as we're creating it to make sure that it's heading where we want it to go. So share your thoughts in the chat about which one of those 3 definitions you like. I personally really identify with the last one, maybe because I like food, so it really sticks with me. Just a couple of other considerations for formative assessment. This one I think is critical. The shorter the time interval between eliciting the evidence and using it to improve instruction, the bigger the likely impact on learning. So if you're thinking about now your current assessment practice, what is the time difference between when you're gaining the data from the students and when you're turning that around to action in the classroom? And if it's a really large time fraction, then we need to work out ways to make that a really quick time fraction. They talk about minute by minute and day by day assessment. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about formative assessment. And then again from Moss and Brookhart, to be considered part of the formative assessment process, information gathered must be used to inform the learning of current students. So it is okay to do an assessment and then think, oh, well, I need to teach that better next year. But to be considered formative, it's really about the current students sitting in front of you. How are you going to adapt your teaching for those students and to improve their learning? I see a couple of questions in the chat about how do we use specific assessments that are designed to be summative in a formative way. And I would draw your attention to this slide. There are two purposes of assessment. One is to support learning and one is to audit learning. And what we need to get better at is making sure that we're using the right tool for the right purpose. So be really clear about what the purpose is of the assessment before you start using it, and really making sure that we're not meddling with wrong purposes and wrong tools. So I think it's really important to understand that different people have different needs when they're looking at the data, and you need to work out what's your level and what are your needs, and is this the right type of assessment to achieve that need. So what the data that a principal required to work out the next steps for whole school improvement will be really different to the data that a teacher requires to work out the minute by minute changes they need to be making in their classrooms. So it's all about using the right tool for the right purpose and being really clear about what your purpose is. Now, speaking about tools, caution, data should be used as a torch and not a hammer. I think you may have been involved in a situation surely in the past where data has been used as a hammer. We need to use it as a torch. Data should have you asking questions. Now, if you participated in the Bastow the Literacy Lead workshops, you will have developed your ability to engage in that double loop learning and staying in that diagnose and evaluate phase. And that's really about using the data to ask questions. And out of that, we develop hunches, so feelings that we have about why the data is the way it is, and that will lead us to ask more questions and seek more evidence. So in that way, it should be used as a torch and not a hammer. I really like that one. Okay, just the next slides that I'm going to be showing you talking about the assessment pyramid and looking at the assessment in the overall, or looking at formative assessment in the overall scheme of assessment. These come from the Literacy Data Assessment and Practice course, affectionately referred to as the LDAP course. This is a Bastow course. We've had 12 intakes start in this year, 2018. It's fully online. There are 6 modules, a beginning, an introduction and a conclusion, and it's been designed by the Will Cobb team. So the people who are Steve and Kay, who have been responsible for creating the Leading Literacy program at Bastow and the Master Trainers program. And the participants in this course can engage in the work at their own pace, and they're supported by an online facilitator who responds to their work and who also facilitates one virtual workshop for each module. And it's been brilliant to be a part of this, and really fascinating to hear the assessment practices that are happening in schools. A lot of this course is based on formative assessment. So I see a lot of people have asked questions in the chat about can you give examples of specific formative assessment you might use for writing? This is the course that will help you to uncover that in more detail. So if you're interested in participating in this course, I suggest you contact the staff at Bastow to see if there are any more spots available. It's a brilliant course, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. Okay, so in that course, we introduce the participants to the assessment pyramid. This is a terrific visual image to display what we're talking about when we're saying a balanced approach to assessment and getting the emphasis into the right places. So we start with the base of the pyramid. This is ongoing in-class formative assessment. And this is the largest part of the pyramid. And I have picked myself up accidentally referring to it as the bottom of the pyramid. I think I try not to refer to it as the bottom because I think that underestimates or undervalues its impact. This is the layer of the pyramid that has the most impact on student learning. The research is robust and conclusive in this area. So the formative assessment works, Moss and Brookhart say, and it works because it has a direct impact, a direct effect on the two most important players in the teaching and learning process, and that's the teacher and the student, remembering that it's a partnership. So as we'll see later in the webinar, we need to be really clear about what assessment we're going to gather formatively and then make it clear about what we're going to do with that information. It's all about action formative assessment. So we'll talk a bit more about some examples of formative assessment as we go along. The next layer of the pyramid, we're talking about end of unit assessments here. So these are implemented periodically as part of the curriculum. They're usually planned units of study, and an example of this might be a post-test. So you might engage in a pre-test before you start a unit of work, and then an end-of-unit assessment would be a post-test to see what the learning has been over that unit of work. So another example of this is student portfolios, and I think this is an area of work that we really have some work to do in, and we can get more benefit out of student portfolios, particularly when it comes to having students locate the work that demonstrates that they've reached a specific learning target. So we'll hopefully be focusing more on portfolios further down the track. The third layer, I'm sure everyone is familiar with. We're talking about benchmark assessments. So these happen through, I see by participating in the LDAP program or course that many of our assessment schedules are heavily laden with these benchmark assessments. An example would be PAT testing, on-demand testing, Fonnis and Pennell. There are lots of examples of this type of testing and assessment, and these really are good for showing student growth over time. These types of assessments are really beneficial for creating data walls, so to measure growth over time. And I saw recently the department have released another practice note on the effective use of data walls, so I certainly recommend having a look at that. And something that's really important to note about these types of assessments is that they can inform your formative assessment. However, they're out of date for this purpose after about 5 or 6 weeks, and that's Fontis and Pennell in particular, and they've been very vocal in saying that themselves. So we can use these assessments to inform our formative assessment. However, they're out of date after 5 or 6 weeks. So you might do your start of year testing and use that to create groups or to work out the needs at the start of the year. But we need to move on to using formative assessment after that, which could be a bit of a difference to how we've been using it in the past. And then finally, we have the national standardised testing. This is the ultimate high stakes test. It is useful for schools to reflect on their curriculum and their teaching, and it is useful for considering growth over time. And Rick Stiggins, who's a really passionate talker he talks about formative assessment, and he has a book called The Perfect Assessment System. He says that even though he isn't a fan of standardised tests, he said that we do need this type of national testing because it helps us to measure growth over time. He also says that schools are institutions supported by communities and that they're entitled to information about where the taxpayer money is going. So that's one version of it. But he said essentially that we need to know what our end point is. So that idea of that cook tasting the soup and the guest tasting the soup, we have to have a really clear vision of what the soup needs to look like at the end. So it is useful for a lot of this. The NAPLAN data can be obviously used by leadership teams to work out areas of need in the school, or strengths. I think that is something that we don't do enough of, looking at our data to look at what are our strengths and why are they our strengths? What are we doing that's contributing to that data? And can we learn, what can we learn from that to apply to other areas of our work? So, having said all of that, the base of the pyramid is the critical point. And as Hattie said about serving poor soup to the guests is probably the best indicator that the cook was lousy at tasting it. If we are not implementing a rigorous system of formative assessment, whereby the teachers are assessing on an ongoing basis and using the information to inform and adapt their teaching, then the other assessments are rendered impotent. So it's really critical that we make sure that the majority of our focus is down here on day by day, minute by minute formative assessment. So as Rick Siggins pointed out, and the other authors have also noted, that we need each of the layers of this assessment's pyramid. The challenge for us is to make sure that we get the balance right. And you might be sitting there now thinking, oh, we've got a bit of rejigging to do in our school to make sure that our balance is right. Because all of the research shows that it is the foundation, the ongoing in-class formative assessment that has the largest impact on student learning. So I'm going to ask you to reflect on your assessment schedule now. I'd like you to pull out the resource pack. It was a link on an attachment on the email, and open up to activity number 2, a balanced approach to assessment. So with your assessment schedule, I'd like you to go through and place your current assessments onto that table to see where are they fitting into the assessment pyramid. And also think about how are we currently using these assessments? What's the purpose at the moment for these assessments? So as you're doing that, I'd like you to think about what you notice, think and wonder, and pop that in the chat. And we'll set the timer for 10 minutes for you to reflect on your school's current approach to see where the balance is in your school. So I'll be back in 10 minutes. Talk about that in a sec.
Going really well. It's going really well.
Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you. Hopefully that's been enough time for you to have a look at your school's practices against the assessment pyramid that we've been using in the LDAP course. It's been fascinating to read the chat and just to have a look and see the difference in schools' approaches so far. There's been quite a few comments about being heavily based in the summative assessment area, and lots of questions about can you use this specific assessment for formative assessment. I would have to agree with Vicky's comment that if you're using the assessment to improve your teaching for the students sitting in front of you right now, and the time fraction, the time as we looked at before, is really close to when you've elicited that information, then yes, it can be classed as formative assessment. So the formative assessment is all about action. It's about gathering that evidence, analysing it, and then changing practice really quickly to adjust to improve student outcomes. So I think it sounds like we do need to adjust many of our assessment schedules. The LDAP course does have some examples on there about what an assessment schedule looks like that does contain formative assessment. One of the things that we've come across in there is that many schools have a summative assessment heavy assessment schedule, and we'll often say, oh, but we do lots of formative assessment. I think if we realise and if we look at the research that says that formative assessment is the assessment that has the most impact on student learning, why would we leave that to chance? Why are we not documenting that on our assessment schedule? That should be on there first to make sure that everyone is engaging in formative assessment. And if you think about if a new teacher were to come to your school, how do they know what formative assessments you're engaged in your school? How are you improving the formative assessments that you do? I think if they're not included in our assessment schedule, we are leaving it to chance, and we are missing out on an enormous opportunity to help improve our student outcomes. Okay, so we are now going to look at 4 elements of effective formative assessment. Oh, sorry, before I go on, I will just say that these slides will be available after tonight. They'll be available on the Bastow website, and we will also be creating a frequently asked question sheet based on your questions that you've been putting into the chat. And I saw a few questions in there about data walls. The number 5 of the department's practice notes is all about data walls and has an example of what they look like. And one of the Bastow crew have put a link to that practice note in the chat. So I do encourage you to go and have a look at that. They can be really valuable sources of discussion for your staff and to help really build that culture of owning all of the students and all of their learning in your school. But we won't be talking about those further tonight, sorry. Okay, so the first element that we'll be discussing is shared learning targets and criteria for success. Okay, so the first step in formative assessment is being clear about our learning goals and what it is you want the students to learn in the session. And as Stephen Covey says, we need to start with the end in mind. What's your end point? And then work backwards from there. Work out what are the smaller chunks of learning that you can engage in to work out what it is that we are focusing on for this specific lesson. So then we need to be public about those learning goals. So if you're anything like me, you will have come through a time when learning goals were mandated in every class at the start of every lesson. And unfortunately, the power of learning goals was lost because it became a compliance activity, and we weren't really sure about what the purpose of the learning goals were, or the learning intentions. So I've just shared this quote with you. Learning intentions are descriptions of what learners should know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a learning period or unit. Learning intentions are the basis for tracking student progress, providing feedback, and assessing achievement. So when we are clear about what the purpose of a learning intention is, that's when we're going to get the most power out of it. It's really important to be public about the learning intention. It should be focused on what the students are to learn, not what activity they are going to do. I think it's almost a whole life's worth of work learning how to write an effective learning intention, but it is a really important part of the work. The learning intention should be translated into language that students can understand, and to the point where if you have a visitor in your classroom, and they should be able to ask your students, what are you learning about? And the students should be able to articulate what's happening on the learning intention in their own words. It's not enough for them to simply parrot back exactly what's written on the board. If you're writing them on the board, they need to understand them, because that gives them the end point for their learning for the session. And they should be communicated in numerous ways and referred to throughout the lesson. So I think that was one of the areas where we didn't get it right when we tried this in the past, is that we would put our learning intention up on the board, we might even read it out at the start of the lesson, and we wouldn't refer to it ever again. The learning intention needs to be a really active and central part of your whole lesson, and it needs to be coming up again and again throughout the lesson. That's our end point, so that we know what type of soup it is that we're wanting to serve up to the guests. So the students are constantly referring back to that learning intention and the success criteria. As they say, if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else. So it's featured in the high impact teaching strategies, and there's a really strong reason for that. It is a really important part of formative assessment. And as we go along, you'll see how this ties into all of the different elements in the formative assessment. So the research supports the belief that learning intentions and success criteria are potentially the most difficult formative assessment element for teachers to implement effectively, and we do need a lot of work on these. It's not easy to write a really effective one. And however, this would be a really great activity for you to engage in with your professional learning communities or your professional learning teams, to really nut out what is the learning intention for a specific lesson or unit of work. So I've got an example here of one that I saw in a classroom just last week. You might be familiar with the WALT, TIB and WILF, the We Are Learning To, This Is Because, and What I'm Looking For. The other thing, what I do like about this is that it's been put into the student language rather than teacher owning the work. So what I'm looking for, I don't really like that vocab. You can see here the teachers changed it to say, I will be able to argue my point. So the students can be constantly referring back to this to say, have I achieved the success criteria, or do I need to do more work? The second part of this is the criteria for success. So our students need to know what success looks like before they begin. And as it says on the slide, we need a vision of the end point. That's what makes the journey possible. And that's that Stephen Covey's start with the end in mind. So sharing good examples of student work or sharing examples of previous work that students have done is a fabulous way to help students understand the success criteria. In the past, we have probably got into the habit of only showing really good examples, but the research shows that we should actually show more than one example, and they should be on a performance continuum. So you might share an okay example, a good example, and an excellent example. And the idea is to not necessarily label them as that when you're introducing them to the students, but to have the students have that discussion and do that evaluation themselves to say which one do they think is a good example, an okay example, and an excellent example. So I've put a little picture on the slide there of a bowerbird. These are the birds that are famous for collecting things. And I think as educators and professionals, we need to get better at being a bowerbird and collecting good sources of good examples that we can use again for our students to show them what success looks like. My husband thinks that I'm a hoarder, but I like to think of it more as a bowerbird. So another part of providing examples, that idea of that performance continuum, it allows the students, if we're presenting them with more than one example and examples of different qualities, so say we're doing a unit of writing, persuasive writing maybe, showing students a good, an okay, and maybe an excellent sample, it allows them to see themselves in that process. So they might look at those examples and think, yeah, I could achieve that level. It gives them an entry and an exit point. And I think that's a really important part of our teaching and learning. And I think I'll read out this quote from Rick Stiggins' book, The Perfect Assessment System. He says, if students decide that success is beyond reach for them, The game is over before we adults ever get a chance to contribute. So can we keep them believing in themselves and keep them willing to take the risk of trying? So our students, when we're showing them the success criteria, they need to be able to believe that they can achieve that success. Otherwise, the job's over for us as educators already before we've even started. So providing a few different examples of student work allows the students to see an entry and exit point that will be suitable for them. Now, the other part about this is that the research shows that providing one sample of work isn't enough for our students. We need to provide a minimum of 2, and that gives them the ability to compare and contrast, and it helps them to decide and work out what are the good qualities in these pieces of work. So if, say for example, it's a piece of writing and you have 2 examples, the students can say, well, I really like this one and this is why. I don't like this one and this is why. This is what it's missing out on. So being really clear on what success looks like. You may have heard of a waggle wall. This is a what a good one looks like wall. So a place in your classroom where students can go to see what a good piece of work looks like, a waggle wall. And if you're on Twitter, you can find some really good examples of waggle walls that people have in use. So this is one example. I think I got this off Twitter. I think this is about a poster creation that one class was doing. And an example of a more senior waggle wall. This has the different levels of, they have pieces of writing, they've got their success criteria up in the top left-hand side, and then they've got levels of work. So you can see that a piece of writing at level 4, 5 and 6, and then they have annotations to help the students understand why the piece of work is at that level. So it's really important, this is at the start of the unit, so the students know where they're heading and they can keep coming back to this resource to check how they're going and maybe self-assess to see where they think they are and what they can be doing to move forward, because that's what formative assessment's all about. How do I get to the next step? How do I improve? Failing, if you don't have access to examples of student work, then the literature suggests that a rubric could fill that gap. It is best having student work samples is the number one. But number 2 is the use of a rubric. There are many cautions about the use of rubrics, however. The rubric needs to be high quality. It can't just be one you've printed off the internet, sorry. That would save us a lot of time, but it's not going to achieve the learning outcome that we're after. And the students need to actually be able to understand what's written in the rubric. Some people create the rubrics with the students, some have the students create the rubrics. The research shows the students aren't great at creating their own rubric because they're more based on aesthetics and spelling and how pretty things look. And like all things, the skills for creating a rubric need to be explicitly taught. So co-creating a rubric is one suggestion, or in your PLC, this should be created well before the unit of work begins so that you have a clear idea about where you are taking the students over the unit of work. So it says there from the ATSA website, rubrics are guidelines for measuring achievement that state the learning intentions with clear performance criteria, and it does need to be clear, a rating scale and a checklist. Ideally, they are relevant to multiple tasks over a unit of learning. So an example of how you might use a rubric is if you are, I always use writing examples. Say if you're teaching a unit of work, a persuasive writing, you might be using the 6 traits approach. So then you might have one column for each of the 6 traits, and you might teach, say, voice over a period of a week, and you'll bring out your rubric to say to the students, this is how the rubric looks at the start of the unit, and we'll be constantly pulling it out for the students to use that to self-assess, to see how did I go with voice after we've done some explicit teaching on it. So you do need to remember they need to be high quality and they need to be provided at the start of a unit. No use providing this at the end of the unit. That will not help the students with their learning and we want them to develop some student agency, and if they've got that success criteria there, they can keep coming back to that. And finally, on the learning intentions and success criteria, the ATSL website has this terrific one-page PDF available, and they've got some really good resources for learning intentions and success criteria. So I recommend you head over to the ATSL website. They talk about what it is, why use learning intentions and success criteria, and just give you some resources to or give you links to other resources, and even talk about some practical techniques. Just before I finish on the learning intentions and success criteria, I will say that some of the literature recommend not necessarily displaying the learning intention at the start of every lesson, and that might be if you're engaging in, say, an inquiry unit or a science experiment where you want the students to you don't want the learning intention to end up as a spoiler alert. So you need to use your professional judgment about when it is you reveal the learning intention, but it is something that you'll constantly refer to. And when you get to the end of your lesson, when you're talking about doing your debrief, that's when you're pulling out your learning intention and your success criteria again, and you're asking the students, how did you achieve the success criteria? Where's the evidence? And having them come up with and demonstrate their evidence for achieving that success criteria. Okay, I've been talking for a bit, so I am going to ask you to reflect now. So if you pull out your resource package, activity number 3, and we're looking at how your thinking is shaping up. So we've got a square, a triangle, and a circle, and I just want you to reflect on that first key element of formative assessment, the learning intentions and success criteria. And then in the chat, you might share your triangle response. So what is the most important thing that you've now learned about using learning intention and success criteria? And I'll just give you 3 minutes to engage in that reflection. Hold on, Tamika, we're going to do that at the end. Okay, thanks very much for your sharing your thoughts in the chat. It is fascinating to see what your takeaways have been, and it's great to see some of your questions in there too. Some people talked about the students co-creating the rubrics with the teachers, and I will talk about that. I have an example of a writing unit of work that I'll talk about later in the webinar, so hopefully that will answer your question about that. Thank you also to those people who have been sharing links and answering other people's questions. That's what a real community of practice or a real professional learning community is about. I'm really excited that this could be the start of a whole state professional learning community. So well done. Okay, so the next element that we're going to discuss is strategic questioning. Now you could dedicate your whole life just to this element. Unfortunately, we only have a small amount of time in our webinar tonight. It is something that I have always wanted to work on more. I'll never be satisfied. So I'm going to read out this quote from Hastings in 2003. It says, an average teacher asks 400 questions each day, roughly 70,000 questions each year, or 2 to 3 million questions over a teaching career. Wow. Only we were paid by the question. So that means teachers spend a third of their time asking questions. Yet most of the questions teachers pose are answered in less than a second. The average time teachers wait before accepting an answer, calling on someone else, or answering the question themselves. Wow. I think that's certainly something for discussion in our PLCs. So this quote is referring to those traditional, it's referred to as IRE questioning. So that initiate, get a response, and then evaluate. So the teacher asks a question, the student responds, and then the teacher responds, whether it's correct or not correct. And Durkin says, if you've participated in the Leading Literacy course, you'll be familiar with Dolores Durkin. She says that it causes too much interrogation and not enough activation of thinking, that type of IRE response. So in terms of formative assessment, we're saying that strategic questions can assist and assess learning. So questioning isn't only about assessing learning, it can also assist the learning. And it's useful for us as teachers to gain information about what the students are thinking if we're asking the right questions. So if we're not asking the right questions and we're only asking those questions that are referred to in the quote there with the 1 second wait time, then we're missing an enormous opportunity to dig deep and expose more of our students' real thinking. And that's when we're talking about formative assessment, we need to know what it is the students are thinking so we can see if there's a difference between our intent and our impact. So when we're talking about intent, we have all these intentions of the things that we'd like to achieve in a lesson and what we want our students to learn, but we need to be constantly measuring our impact. Is our intent matching our impact? And that's what formative assessment is all about. So you may have heard of the term data mining. Well, really here, with the use of strategic questions, we're really talking about understanding mining. We're trying to get into the heads of our students and find out what they're thinking and what they know. So a rich series of questioning can reveal our students' real thinking and understanding of a topic or a process, and that is terrific formative assessment for us. So we're constantly asking ourselves, do we need more salt? Should we be adding pepper? Is it time to put in all the veggies for our soup? Do we need to turn it up? Do we need to scrap the soup and start all over again? And we're getting that information through our strategic questioning. So this concept of funneling questions versus focus questions comes from Fisher, Frey and Hattie. I can tell you right now, they're not responsible for this terrible diagram that I've created. So the first one is the funnel, and funneling questions, a series of funneling questions results in steering students towards predetermined correct answers. So we've got an answer in our head and we're asking a series of questions so that the student can eventually come up with the answer that we've already determined in our head. And it leaves little room for students to consider the possibilities and notice their own thinking. So the other poorly drawn diagram on there is actually a torch facing down. It's poor when I have to explain what it is, isn't it? And I'm there for focus questions. So focus questions, they can open up student thinking and provide you with more insight into their thought processes. So the most effective strategic questions are open-ended questions, that really require the students to think hard about the task and about their own thinking related to the task, that idea of metacognition. So we're really working on developing more of these focus questions for our students. So an example of a strategic question that could assist the learning would be having students reflect on processes might be, what strategies did you use when you were putting your poster together and that helped to keep you organised? And would you use these strategies next time, or would you do something differently next time? So it's important to know these questions, as much as we would love to say that we can come up with these questions off the cuff, they really should be planned for. So when you're creating your unit of work, if you're fortunate enough to be planning in a team, or I understand that many of us in regional areas don't have that luxury, but when we're doing our planning, we need to be thinking about what's my learning intention for this specific lesson, and then what are some key strategic questions that I could ask to really elicit the information or the knowledge of the students about this topic, and to help me understand if there's a difference between my intent and my impact. So these are planned for. I'd love to be able to and sometimes, when you're on a good day, you can come up with these off the cuff, but usually they need to be planned for. So another great activity for your PLC to engage in, to think about what would be the key questions for this lesson and really crafting more effective questions. So to help you to think about the effectiveness of your questions or the type of questions that you're asking your students, it is useful to think of Bloom's taxonomy, pulling that out from the university days, and thinking about flipping that pyramid so that we're asking more questions higher up, so that those higher order thinking questions or the higher order questions. So in that creating, evaluating and analysing levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. So, and always asking and when we're reflecting on our questioning, thinking, what type of thinking is this question generating? So are we creating funneling questions, or are we creating focus questions? And then how will this question help students engage in and with the material? So remembering that the purpose of questioning isn't just to test students' knowledge. So an activity I highly recommend is for you to record yourself when you're teaching. So you could either do that with your own mobile phone, so you can use the audio, or you could do a video. And it only needs to be a really short snippet, even 10 minutes, so that you can listen back to yourself when you're asking questions and when you're, say, if you're doing your mini lesson, and reflecting on the types of questions you're asking your students to see what type of information you're able to gain through the questions that you're asking. And I know no one likes listening to themselves back, but it is a really useful activity and no one else needs to see it. That's just for you to listen back to. So you can see some of the questions there that you might be asking. What would happen if? How would you test? You could see how that would gain better or more information than saying, where is this? When did this happen? And just testing the right there facts. I love this quote. A good question generates a silence filled with thought, which leads to talk. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about strategic questioning. The image on the left, we're talking about wait time. So we saw in that quote earlier that our average wait time currently is 1 second. That is not giving enough time for students to really engage in their thinking and to notice their own thinking. So we need to start extending our wait time. And there are lots of strategies for extending wait time. One of those is no hands up, and that's when you say to the students, I'm going to ask a question and I don't want anyone to put their hand up. I'll call on someone after after a period of time. And that means that all of the students will then be engaged in thinking, I'll have to think about this. If you say, I'm going to ask a question and Isaac, I'd like you to answer this question, it turns off the rest of the students in the class and they think they've now got a free ride because Isaac's the one that has to do the work. So no hands up is one strategy. There's also think, pair, no hands up. So that's when you ask a question, you have students turn and talk, and again, no hands up, and then you'll call on a pair to give their answer. Or another modification of that is that think square, no hands up. So do the same thing, turn and talk to your partner, and then have the two partners have 4 students turn and talk, and then call on an answer call on a student for an answer. So a few different ideas for wait time. If you record your lesson or a snippet of your lesson, you can have a look at and evaluate yourself how much wait time are you giving your students. And the final part to strategic questioning is really about teaching students how to engage in deeper discussion in the class, remembering that our job when we're formatively assessing is we're trying to find out as much information about our students' knowledge as we can, and a lot of that comes through substantive talk in the classroom. And I saw a question earlier in the chat, someone had asked, how do you document that substantive talk? And I'd probably ask, do you need to document it? So as a professional, we need to start trusting our own judgment. And one of those, one place that judgments can come from is from listening to that rich, substantive conversation that should be happening in our classroom, or that will start happening after the webinar. So some strategies to extend thinking, and I'd be really public with these with the children, and how to help them to have better discussions in the classroom. So you might ask them to elaborate. Tell me more about that, and get the students to engage in these engage in these extensions as well. So another example is, now that we've heard Paige's idea, what are you thinking? So we're constantly building on other people's ideas and really engaging that metacognition and noticing our own thinking. So another one, what Ashley said makes me wonder about, we need to model this as educators as well. So when a student responds, it's really good for us to model, oh, actually, now that Ashley said that, that's making me think about this. Is it making you think anything else? Modelling how to summarise. So, and again, you could model that yourself, or then ask other students to summarise what another student is talking about, and then reflecting on the use of strategies. So you can use these on an anchor chart or a poster in your classroom to help students develop those rich discussions. This is a great source of formative assessment for you to work out how your students are going with the learning intention that you've created for this lesson or this unit. So we're going to engage in our own self-reflection now, thinking about your own thinking. And in the chat, I'd like you, so if you go back to the activity 3, and we're just reflecting on the second key element now. And in the chat, if you just share, this time I'll get you to share your circle response. So what is it that's still rolling around your head about questioning? What questions do you have about questioning? All right, I'll give you 3 minutes and then we'll be back. Okay, that ends our reflection time. Thank you again for sharing your thoughts in the chat. It certainly helps me with my formative assessment for how the masterclass is going. And a special hello to Carmen. I see that you're in there and she's just heading off for her long drive home. Luckily, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch this on your weekends, Carmen, and repeat probably. Okay, so I've had a few questions in the chat about how you'd go about improving the questioning of the staff. I think this would be a great PLC activity. So I think if you have, and I've used in the past, one video clip of a staff member who was willing to do it, a 10-minute mini lesson, and we pull that same video out over and over again to look at it with a different lens. So having a look at the lesson with the staff and assessing it using whatever framework you're interested in using. So you might use the Bloom's framework, you might use another framework for assessing the questioning, or just simply looking at open and closed. And then I see someone ask a question about how many questions would you plan for, and I would agree no more than 3. It goes back to that idea that the idea of asking the question is to generate discussion. So you really don't need more than 3 questions planned for, because it's the discussion that comes out after the question that acts as your formative assessment. You're listening into the students' conversations and finding out what their understanding is about the topic that you're talking about. So certainly a whole life's worth of work there, learning how to ask effective questions. And there are some resources available. Asking Better Questions, that's a book that is available for that. And they've got lots of different versions of frameworks that you can use to ask better questions in your classroom. So that's just one of the resources available. Okay, we are going to look at number 3 now, the provision of effective feedback. And I'm sure you're familiar with the data from Hattie on the effect size of using feedback in the classroom. So we couldn't miss that out as one of the key elements of formative assessment tonight. Okay, essentially feedback should help the students to answer one of 3 questions, or all 3 of the questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And where to next? Or how do I close the gap? And you can see how this links back to the learning intention. So the students need to know, where am I going? That's the learning intention and the success criteria. Where am I now is when you're providing the feedback and helping the students to self-assess. And where to next, that's where feedback that feeds forward helps the students to answer that question. So Brookhart there says formative feedback involves giving students comments, then giving a student additional performance opportunities within the same learning cycle. So the difference with formative feedback and summative feedback is that the students have a chance to adjust their work and their learning after they've been given the feedback. And I'll demonstrate that with a diagram. I think it'll make it clearer. So you can see that we model and explain. So we might be doing our mini lesson, our explicit teaching. We'll engage in some guided practice. And then the students will engage in a performance of understanding. So that's when they're engaged in the work that we've set for them. Then we'll be giving them formative feedback, or they might be getting feedback from their peers. And after that, they've got another chance to re-engage in the work so they can improve their own performance. So this is different to, say, the traditional model that we may be used to, where we explain the lesson, we might engage in guided practice, then the students will engage in a task to show their understanding, and then we give them a feedback or a grade, and then we move on to the next lesson. And the students don't have that opportunity to go back and use that feedback in their learning. So the most effective feedback, or the most effective learning, happens when students know what they're trying to learn, what the end point is, and then they use criteria to compare their work to the goal. So that's our waggle wall and our success, our student samples. And then they take action. It's all about action, remember, to modify and improve their work. So you can see this, the difference between maybe the traditional, the summative cycle on the right and the formative cycle on the left. And potentially on the right, if you think about maybe the end of term when the kids are cleaning out their lockers and they're putting all of their work into their bag, and we've spent hours writing out feedback on all this work, and it just goes home and never to be used again. So we need to remember that, going back to that quote that says that students are given additional performance opportunities within the same learning cycle. So you might have students engaged in an activity, say a writing activity, and you'll be giving them some feedback that feeds forward. So that's giving them some ideas for next steps. And then they'll either go back on that same piece of work and have another go, or they'll have another opportunity within the same unit of work to improve what they're doing. And I've got an example at the end where I talk about a unit of work from start to finish where you can see that playing out. Okay, we're going to watch a video now that comes from the ATSL website. The ATSL website's got some really terrific resources on it, and this is about formative assessment. So I will say that with the ATSL website, they have got some Australian case studies of schools who've worked on their ability to provide effective feedback to students, and you can go on there and watch some video clips and access supporting resources to help you to improve the feedback that you're giving your students. So we'll have a look at this video now.
Feedback is a powerful way to achieve improvement in teaching and learning. It is an integral part of every teacher's practice and, when used effectively, can improve student learning by as much as 8 months. As teachers and school leaders, it's essential to understand what evidence-based feedback is if we're to unlock the greatest possible benefits for our students. So, what does the research tell us about feedback in teaching? Feedback is an ongoing process of goal setting, gathering evidence about student learning, and providing instruction that makes clear the next actions to improve performance. Feedback can be given by the teacher, peers, or the student themselves. 2 evidence-based models for feedback have been developed by Hattie and Timperley and Black and William. Both models propose 3 important questions for both the student and teacher to consider. Where is the learner going? Students and teachers need to be clear about the learning goals and what success looks like. Goals need to be appropriately challenging so the students can succeed and grow. Where is the learner right now? Evidence is gathered about the student's knowledge, skills and performance relative to the learning goals and tasks. How does the learner get there? This involves clarifying the steps the student needs to take to achieve the learning goals. If needed, the teacher adapts or changes the teaching and learning activities to meet the student's needs. Feedback can be directly related to the learning task, which is useful. However, feedback about the processes underlying the task or about how students self-regulate their learning is more powerful. So, what are the benefits of effective feedback? Research indicates that effective feedback can increase student effort and outcomes, lead to more effective learning strategies, and improve student self-regulation. The benefits for teachers are also significant. Effective feedback practices provide evidence about student learning related to learning goals and the curriculum. This helps teachers understand the impact of their teaching and, if needed, where to adapt strategies to better meet the needs of their students. To improve and sustain good feedback practices, it is vital that educators work collaboratively. School leaders can support teachers by prioritising feedback and implementing a whole school approach, providing access to resources and opportunities for professional learning and collaboration. Teachers can develop their feedback practices by communicating clear learning goals, trialling activities that provide evidence of student learning, planning for task, process and self-regulated feedback, checking that students understand and act on the feedback provided, and working with colleagues to develop and refine feedback practices. Feedback is evidence-based and inexpensive to implement. It offers a powerful approach to enriching teacher practice and significantly enhancing student growth. For resources that will help you improve your feedback practices, visit aitsl.edu.au.
There we go, little advertisement for the ATSL website at the end there, certainly worth a look. So I see a couple of questions in there about how do we give feedback if we have so many students, and as you will have seen at the start of that short clip, feedback isn't just coming from the teacher, it's coming from peers and from yourself, and that goes back to that, the second definition that we looked at right at the start of the webinar about formative assessment and who's involved in that process. So we look at the provision of effective feedback. Hattie and Timperley, and they mentioned Hattie and Timperley's work in that ATSL clip, distinguish 4 categories of feedback. So they say that feedback about the task includes information about the errors, so whether something is correct or incorrect, or you need add this here or take that out there. It might include comment about the depth or the quality of the work, but it's really about that specific task that you've asked them to do. So I guess one problem about feedback about the task is that because it is applicable specifically to that task, then it might the feedback, it might be limited, the application of that feedback to other tasks. So if I've said, for example, that you need to include more information in this paragraph, that's very task specific. So that is one of the downsides of task feedback about the task. So feedback about self-regulation is the third one. And this focuses on increasing students' commitment to the task or their self-direction. And again, it's about that metacognition and noticing their own thinking. So it's really about helping students to develop that self-efficacy or that belief in themselves that they can do it, and helping them to see the thinking behind what they've done. And feedback about the person, I think this is probably the most common feedback. It's the least effective form of feedback though. And that's an example of that is good girl, or you're really smart, well done Ash, well done Isaac. And it's this kind of, if you've done any work on Carol Dweck's growth mindsets, this really reinforces that fixed mindset, this type of feedback. So that idea that we're either born smart or we're born dumb, and that feedback about the person perpetuates that idea that we're born a certain way and we can't fix it. It's fixed. We have a fixed mindset. So we need to be really trying to focus on the feedback about the task or the processing of the task or the self-regulation, not specific to about the person. And again, can't recommend enough filming yourself or recording the audio of yourself speaking to students to analyse the type and the amount of feedback that you're giving, and who are you giving it to and how often. So, I mean, you could also ask a colleague to come into your room and observe a lesson and just have them write down the feedback that they hear you giving. And you could do that for the questioning as well. So this is when we're talking about teachers giving feedback. The other part, and as Dylan William referred to, is that peers can give each other feedback. This is you need to explicitly teach students how to give feedback though. This is not a skill that we are all born with. We're still working out how to do it ourselves as teachers. So how do we expect our students to do this? So I'll just give you an example of a unit of work I did with the students. We were doing a piece of writing. We use Google Docs for it. And before I did any explicit teaching about how to give feedback, you can see the feedback that was given. Regan says, "I like it." So really doesn't help the writer answer those 3 questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And where to next? So did a lot of work with the students about provision of feedback, what type of feedback is useful and good, and really brought it back to the success criteria and the learning intention, and had the students, we talked about 2 glows and 1 grow. That's just one version of feedback that you can do. There's lots of schools have different ideas for frameworks that you can use. In this case, the students used 2 glows and 1 grow. So 2 things you did really well and 1 area for you to improve on. So that's the idea of where am I now and where to next. And you can see that the progression, it's not a perfect example because this is an example on the continuum. So the next time they gave a comment, this was their comment. Very different. When I read your persuasive text, I found that you have added your expanded vocab and the way that you added strong opinions and facts. Maybe try adding some pictures. Can't remember that being on the assessment criteria, but anyway. And I did find that you used strong words, but I think you may have used them a bit too much in every sentence. But to tie it up, it was awesome. Good job. It gives a lot more information than the first attempt. I like it. So we definitely need to tightly scaffold our students when they're giving feedback. And I would recommend that one idea for this is to really closely link it to so if you're using a rubric or some type of criteria, that you have students have that next to them when they're looking at the piece of work, and that they need to tie their feedback directly to what's written on that rubric. And that helps them to internalise the rubric, so they know what the criteria for the work is. There's a lot of work that needs to go towards actually giving and receiving feedback from peers. So just a couple more points about the provision of feedback that feeds forward. To be effective, feedback needs to cause thinking. And if you think about that, going back to that, the type of feedback about the person, when we're saying good girl, Ash, or good work, Ash, does that cause feedback? Does it cause thinking? I wouldn't say it does. So to be effective, it needs to cause thinking. Feedback has to apply to the work students did, not the work they should have done. Very interesting one from Brookhart there. And I can think of a few examples in my head about where that would be applicable. And then the final one, I've put that in there because participating in the LDAP course, the Literacy Data Assessment Practice Bastow course, it's been really interesting to see. One of the activities we asked the participants to do was to survey the students and to ask the students what they thought assessment was, and to ask them a few questions about feedback. And it was really interesting to see that we asked the participants to reflect on what the students had said, and overwhelmingly, the students had said that they weren't receiving, or that there was a difference between what the teachers thought they were going to say about feedback, and their prediction was that the students would be saying, "I get feedback all the time from my teacher and from these other people." And the students, though, that they weren't saying that. They weren't saying, "I get feedback all of the time." They was telling us they get feedback every now and then. And the teachers in the LDAP course were saying, "Well, I'm giving feedback all the time. How could they be saying that?" Well, Fisher, Frey and Hattie say that many students will claim they did not receive feedback if the aspect of where to next isn't included in the feedback. So if you're only talking about giving the first part of those three questions, then the students aren't considering that to be feedback. So we could be spending hours giving feedback to our students on where they are now and where they're going, only to be thwarted because they're seeking where to next. And I thought that was really interesting because that was really evident in the responses in the LDAP course. And to finish off our focus on feedback, unfortunately we haven't got more hours to be talking about feedback because we could certainly talk about it all night. The ATSL website, again, has a really terrific resource, a one-pager on the provision of feedback, what it is, what effective feedback looks like, a little bit about what it can achieve as well, and again, some links to other resources. Another resource I would recommend for that is a book by Susan Brookhart, How to Give Effective Feedback to Your Students. And I've included that in a slide at the end, so you can have a look at that if you want to look at that in a PLC maybe in the future. So again, time for you to reflect on the effective element of feedback as a form that helps you with your formative assessment. And I'll get you to share your circle response again in the chat. So what questions do you still have about the use of feedback? And I'll put the timer on for 3 minutes. Okay, thanks again for contributing to the chat. I see some really interesting questions in there. I'll just finish off the feedback section reading a couple of quotes from Susan Brookhart's book, How to Give Effective Feedback to Your Students. She says, good feedback contains information that students can use, which means that students have to be able to hear and understand it. Even the most elegantly phrased feedback message will not improve learning unless both the teacher and the student learn from the feedback process, and unless the student has and takes advantage of an opportunity to use the feedback. She says formative feedback is part of this process. It is not giving comments on final work at the end of the lesson. We talked about that traditional model versus the formative model. Formative feedback involves giving comments, then giving a student additional performance opportunities within the same learning cycle. Okay, so wise words from Susan Brookhart there. Now, yes, for verbal feedback is absolutely fine, and that's probably the most common type of feedback we'll be talking about, particularly when we're engaging in formative assessment. So we might be conferring with a student if we're doing, say, reading, and the conference, they only need to go for a maximum of 5 minutes. I think that's another area that we need to be adjusting. And that the student needs to be able to leave your conference knowing what it is they need to work on between now and next time to help them progress forward. That idea of having the learning intention and the success criteria really clearly stated and understood by the students helps them to provide feedback to themselves. So it's not you having to give feedback to every single student every single lesson, but it's you creating structures so that students can receive constant feedback, whether that's from their peers or from themselves by self-assessing against the criteria, or whether it's from you or someone else. So hopefully that clarifies some of the questions in there, which leads us nicely on to the final element that we're discussing tonight. I'm not saying that there are only 4 elements. These are just the 4 that we're looking at tonight. Student self-assessment. Okay. So student self-assessment is, or why do we do this? Time getting students to reflect on their learning makes them more powerful learners, and that's why we're here. We're creating lifelong learners, and we're talking about high-impact teaching strategies that can engage students in lifelong learning. So we've already discussed the use of rubrics. The literature suggests, though, when we're talking about self-assessment, that we're using rubrics for improvement ideas rather than scores. So we're not asking students to go through and give yourself a score out of 30. We're saying, look at the rubric and work out where your own strengths and weaknesses are in this piece of work, and what do you think you need to do to move into the next box. That might be different to how we've been using the rubrics in the past. And students get more out of evaluating their own work than the work of others. Now, this is interesting. I found this interesting anyway. They talk about that if we ask students to assess a peer's work, then it is beneficial for them. However, it's more beneficial if they're assessing their own work. And the reason behind this is that when they're assessing their own work, say if they're assessing it against a rubric, then they have really clear next steps for themselves to go back and apply. And the literature suggests that when they're assessing the work of a peer, then they don't get as much out of it in terms of their own learning. Where am I? How do I need to move forward? So I found that interesting. Self-evaluation should be encouraged throughout the lesson. So this is not something that we're just doing at the end. How did you go through in that lesson? We're encouraging it throughout the whole lesson because we're referring to our learning intention and our success criteria throughout the lesson. So an example of this you might do as a midway or before, if you say you might have the students on the floor, you've done an explicit lesson on something, and you might just do a quick self-evaluation, thumbs up, thumbs to the side, or thumbs down with how you're feeling about this concept. And that gives you a really quick snapshot of formative assessment to say who needs more support, who thinks that they're going okay with this. Just a really quick bit of data in there. Ask students to identify changes that they would make next time. Now, this is interesting, William and Leahy say that if we ask students to, so if we've asked them to do a piece of work, a writing, for example, and then we're asking them to self-assess using the rubric, and then every time we're forcing them to then go back and make those adjustments to that specific text, then they'll cotton on that self-assessment is tied to more work, and that will devalue the self-assessment process. So they're suggesting that you could ask the students, if you were to do this again, what would you add or do differently next time? Not always actually making them follow up and make those specific changes. And I found that interesting because I think in my own experience, I have seen that where students will go, well, hang on a second, the more I pick out of this, the more work I'm going to have to do. So again, that's that idea of doing a little assessment along the way and then providing another opportunity for the students to apply their learning in the same unit in another way. So Moss and Brookhart said, to self-assess well, students need a clear concept of the learning goals and criteria, skill at recognising these characteristics in their own work when they see them, and skill at translating their self-assessment judgments into action plans for improvement. Again, we're going back to this is all about action. So we've learnt this, what does it mean? What are we going to change? So you can see the links to other elements of formative assessment here, and you can see how critical those learning goals and success criteria are in the whole formative assessment process. I'm going to give you an example now. This is a unit of work the students did, a group of students did on persuasive writing, I think it was. Information report, am I wrong? And so what happened was the students engaged in, I think some schools refer to it as a cold write, which I really don't like the wording for that because it sounds so unfriendly, but the students were asked to write an information report as they knew an information report at the start of the unit. And that was done on a piece of notepad, so then the teacher went and photocopied all of those and put them aside for later. So then the class went through and they looked at different examples of information reports, and I talked about that continuum, that performance continuum. So they looked at good examples and excellent examples and okay examples, and that helped them to really establish what are the elements of an effective information report. And when they did that as a class, they came up with sort of a recipe, I guess, of what are the effective elements of an information report, and using those elements, the teacher then created this rubric and went through the rubric with the students so that they were aware, do we all agree that this was one of the elements that we said was present in the excellent example? Then they pulled out the student's own piece of writing that they'd done at the start of the unit, the cold write, and the students self-assessed based on that rubric that they'd co-created with the teacher. And you can see in that example on the left-hand side there, the students used a highlighter. So say for column 1, row 4, it says word choice. Then they've gone and highlighted the evidence in their writing that backs up why they've given themselves a 2 or whatever it is for word choice. So they're proving to themselves, where's the evidence that says that I've met this success criteria. Out of this, they then created next steps for themselves. So next time when I write an information report, what will I do differently? What will I include, or what will I need to take out? So that's that whole idea that Dylan William was talking about. Don't get them to fix that first version, but next time when they write their information report in the same unit, which they will do in a couple of weeks' time once they've gone through more of the elements, then they'll have a chance to apply that learning that they've done in the unit, if that makes sense. So you could also then pass this piece of writing on to a peer and have the peer do it as well. But I think the power in this is that self-assessment, where the students having to work out for themselves where they sit on that criteria. And of course, you'll have students who rank themselves really highly and some who are really harsh, but by asking them to highlight the evidence, that helps to moderate a few of those highs and lows. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is we are going to look at all of those 4 elements that we've just discussed and have a think about where you can see those in the HITS, the high impact teaching strategies. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to have a look through the hits and be thinking about those 4 elements. Where are they evident in the hits? And in the chat, I'd love you to share, if you had to choose the 3 hits that most closely linked with the elements of formative assessment, which hits would they be? Which high impact teaching strategies most closely align with these elements of formative assessment? Okay, off you go. Okay, I am conscious of the time and I do want to go through an example of what this would look like in a workshop. So I'm really sorry, but I'm going to cut your thinking time short. I see some of you have been a bit naughty in the chat and you've chosen more than 3 of the hits, but you can see how hard it is just to choose the 3. And I'm not sure what even my answer would be, but certainly goal setting would be in there because I think you can see that it just keeps coming back in each of the elements. So thanks for contributing your ideas. So I am going to go through now and just show you a quick example of how this might look in a workshop model. So if you've participated in the Leading Literacy program, you'll be familiar with the workshop model. This one's from Chris Tavani. It's displayed as a pie chart because then you can fill in your own times depending on your lesson lengths. So you might use this for reading or writing. When we're talking about instructional models, this is a highly research-based approach. So we start the lesson with the opening. That's where we're talking about our learning intentions and our success criteria. And you can see the time fraction there on that pie chart. We're not taking the whole lesson to do this. I will say that if you're at the start of a unit of work, you might dedicate more time to this. And as you get through that unit of work, this section will become smaller in time as you go along. So this is where we're talking about learning intention and the success criteria. The next part of the lesson is the mini lesson. And the main part of this is the fact that it's mini. So the literature suggests that a mini lesson should go for no longer than about 10 minutes. And that is a real challenge for us educators. We love to talk, and keeping our mini lesson mini is certainly an area of work for us. So I do recommend getting yourself a little timer there. So in the mini lesson, we might be asking some of those strategic questions that we've developed. We'll be doing our explicit teaching, and we'll be demonstrating to students what success looks like here as well. And this is an opportunity for the students to really be clear about what it is that we want them to learn during the session. After the mini lesson, the students go off and do their work. So this follows the idea that the person doing the work is doing the learning. And in the workshop model, the students are doing most of the work. So while work time is happening, so if this is a reading workshop, the students might be engaged in independent reading in this time. And the teacher might be engaged in guided reading or conferences. And remembering that our conferences, they're really critical for helping to give students that feedback that feeds forward and talking to students about their reading. So that's what's happening in the work time. The literacy toolkit that's available on the department's website has some fabulous resources to support what you would be doing in this work time. So you can go on there and find out what is the pure form of guided reading. How does it look? There's even videos. What resources might you use? Also for independent reading and modelled reading, shared reading, that type of thing. In a writer's workshop, this is when the students are going away and actually testing out their writing. They're going and doing the writing. And as a teacher, this is a very, very active time for you. You do not have time to be checking your email during the readers or the writer's workshop. This is your prime opportunity to be gathering formative assessment, to measure the difference between your intent and your impact. So I've set up I've set up some learning as a learning intention, and you're going around and seeing, is this hitting the ground? How's the soup tasting? Do I need to add salt? Do I need to restart the soup? Am I making the wrong soup? Is probably another question. Hopefully not. So that's what's happening in the work time. And as you are walking around and engaging with the students in this work time, you are gathering your formative assessment. You're testing how things are going. And the next part is called the catch. So this is where it could be planned before the lesson begins. It might be unplanned. So you've walked around, you've given some advice to students, or you've set out the learning intention for reading or writing, and you notice that a few of the students haven't quite grasped the concept. This is your opportunity, and it's very small. Have a look at the time fraction there, to pause the lesson and to readjust. So you could add salt here, you could reteach something, or you could be giving next steps. So this might be the time when you turn the heat up and add the veggies. So this is the time when you're readjusting, using that information from your formative assessment and quickly turning it into action. We need to know what the soup's tasting like so we can get to the end point at the end of the lesson. And then back to work. So the students are re-engaged in the work that they're doing. And that goes back to that idea before that when they're getting feedback, they need another opportunity to then apply that feedback. So we're giving them another opportunity because they're going back to work. So in a reader's workshop, they might be going back to independent reading, or they might be engaging in lit circles here, or they might be you might have a group of students who have a similar need that you've got down on the floor and they're doing guided reading with you for a similar need. Okay, so in a writer's workshop, you may have noticed while you were circulating that a few students had a common need. You've got them together in a group now, while the rest of the students might be engaged in writing or peer conferencing and giving feedback to each other. And then finally is the debrief. Now the debrief is quite often left off because our mini lessons accidentally turned into a maxi lesson. Whoops. This is a really critical part of the lesson because this is the time when the students have the opportunity to reflect on the learning intention and the success criteria, to evaluate themselves, to say, how am I going? What do I need to do next? So I've seen different versions of this. In a prep classroom, I've seen a teacher, because this is in here, sometimes it's share time, sometimes it's synthesis of learning. So I've seen a teacher ask, this was our learning intention, so I'll use the voice example again. Our learning intention was to use voice in our writing. And can you read out the sentence or the two sentences in your writing that demonstrated really good use of voice, what you think is good use of voice? We're not listening to the whole entire text. We're just referring to the learning intention. In reading, you might go back to your learning intention and can you give me an example of where you visualised in the text? So go back through the text and share that paragraph or share that sentence that helped you to create a really vivid image in your mind. So we're constantly referring students back to that learning intention and success criteria here. In the prep classroom, I saw a teacher say to the students they had 5 things that the teacher had asked them to make sure they were including. It was at the end of a unit of work. So she asked them to look at their piece of writing in front of them and they draw a circle if they had included one element. So say, for example, if that included spaces between their words or some of their words, draw a big circle, the outside of the face. And then if that included capital letters or at least one capital letter, they could draw their own little one eye. And then if they'd included something else, they could draw the other eye. And then if they'd included something else, they could draw their mouth. So they could then reflect on, oh, my head only has one eye and a mouth, so I've got a bit of work to do next time. So that's just an example of where in a workshop model you would be providing or gaining and using your formative assessment. You can see it is that minute by minute, day by day, and we're using the assessment that we're gathering to really quickly turn it around into action, that we're changing our teaching for the students who are sitting in front of us right now. Okay, so it's all focused on the student learning. We're very close to the end of the time, so I'm going to quickly show you some resources. The department's practice notes, you may or may not be familiar with those. They're available on the EdgeGate website. So they've got one of those for data walls and one for formative assessment that's come up recently. Have a look at those. There's the ATSA website. There's the LDAP Bastow course, which I highly recommend, but I am biased because I am running two of the intakes. On the left-hand side of the screen there, you'll see on the VCAA website, they actually have work samples for reading and viewing. So you can go on and have a look, and they've got videos of students reading. This is what a reader looks like, and this is how these are the behaviours at level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's brilliant. And it will really help you with your moderation, I think. So that's certainly something worth looking at. That's on the VCAA website. And a couple of books worth investing in. The first one is that Moss and Brookhart book, Advancing Formative Assessment in Every Classroom. The second one is Dylan William and Siobhan Leahy's book, Embedding Formative Assessment, practical techniques for K-12 classrooms. If you only have $50, I'd probably buy the first one and then the second one. And another couple of books, Rick Stiggins, he's very passionate about recreating how we do assessment. He's an American author. The Perfect Assessment System. He's got some YouTube clips too that are certainly worth having a look at. And finally, How to Give Effective Feedback to Your Students. That's Susan Brookhart has done that one. That's got some really practical ideas in there as well. Now, that brings us to the end of tonight's masterclass. I'm really grateful for you all joining us here on our first masterclass series. Hopefully it's something that Bastow will continue to support because it's getting that high quality professional learning out to regional and rural areas as well as the metro areas. So you may not have known, but signing up to tonight's masterclass automatically gives you entry to the next 3 masterclasses. So there's a freebie from Bastow, very exciting. And you'll receive an updated notification when the webinar links are live for Masterclass 2, which you can see there is evidence-based high-impact teaching strategies. And that's facilitated by Dr. Beverly Derawenka. And she'll provide a practical introduction to the language strand of the English curriculum, exploring grammar as a dynamic and functional resource for meaning making. So through this webinar, participants will engage in a range of activities designed to support children make powerful and informed choices in their writing. So I guess that works in really well with how much I've mentioned writing tonight. So that will be happening on Tuesday, April the 17th. And again, that will be recorded so you can look at that and watch that on your weekends or maybe watch it back with your staff. So thanks very much for participating in the webinar tonight. I'm going to leave on this slide here. This is the final reflection because what we're talking about all night, we've been talking about action. So now you've participated in a 2-hour masterclass. What's the action that you are going to take? This is the part where the rubber hits the road. So have a think about your current practice. What could you build on, add, or remove or replace in your current practice? And let's say over the next 5 weeks, because Dr. Mary Jean Gallagher talks about working in small snippets of time. What will you build on, add, remove, or replace in your own practice as a response to your participation in tonight's webinar? And I'll be looking in the chat to see, and that I'll use that as my own version of formative assessment. I appreciate you. Thank you for adding that to the chat. And I'll be having a look to see what the impact has been to measure the difference between my intent and my impact. So good luck with it. It's a very important piece of work, and I'll leave that up, and you can keep chatting, and we'll send out the slides after tonight's masterclass. So thanks very much, everyone. It's been lovely to have you.